Morning and welcome to the National Lottery Community Fund's Lockdown Loneliness events. I am Sophie Proctor and I'm your chair for this session. I lead on funding, tackling loneliness across the fund, and I work on some significant programmes in this area, including the Ageing Better strategic programme. So this is another in a series of virtual events we've been running on loneliness that began right back in the misty past before words like lockdown were part of our everyday vocabulary. So first of all, before I introduce our wonderful speakers, I want to highlight a bit of housekeeping for everyone. If you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function to do so, and I will raise it with the panel. We'll try and get through all of the questions, but I do need to let people know we can't answer questions along the lines of, please will you fund us? If you are keen to find out more information on our funding, my colleague will add this link to the chat function for this purpose. So to keep the conversation going on Twitter, please use the hashtags TNLComFund event and lockdown loneliness, which are also going to be posted in the chat function. And now we have, as usual, a wonderful set of speakers with some great experience to share relating to a wide range of people and communities, which really illustrate how loneliness touches so many people in so many ways. We will start with my colleague, Ewan Davison, who's going to provide a snapshot of some of our learning from our grant holders' experiences. Following this, I'm going to introduce our panel for the session. We have 4 individual speakers. After each speaker, you'll have the chance to ask questions. Again, please post in the chat. And at the end of the session, we're all coming together as a panel, so there'll be an opportunity to explore things a bit further. Our speakers today are Kevin Stoodley. Kevin founded Northeast Young Dads and Lads in 2017, following a pilot project. And 4 years on, he's worked with over 200 young men facing fatherhood in Tyne and Wear. I can see Kevin's just waved hi. We've got Jane Lees, CEO of Community Works, who's going to be speaking about their Nanny G project in Bradford. Community Works, very much a place-based organisation working with their community in inner city Bradford across all ranges, age ranges, and supporting about 300 plus people every week. We've got Amy Holland, who's founder of Single Parents Wellbeing CIC. Amy is herself a single mother of 2 and the director and development lead for this organisation. She's a peer lead and she's led on pivoting the organisation to focus online, which obviously has a lot of connotations and learning for us all. And then we have Robin Hewings, Director of Campaigns, Policy and Research for the Campaign to End Loneliness. I'm sure we're all aware of the campaign now. They've done some great work through the lockdown. Robin's the director who leads a team driving action on loneliness through research, convening and influencing, and he helps to write the most recent report, The Psychology of Loneliness. So we're going to start off without further ado by introducing my colleague Ewan Davison, who's going to take us through our learning from our grant holders at this time. Thank you, and I'll hand over to Ewan.
Thanks, Sophie. I'm Ewan from the Fund's Knowledge and Learning team. We work across the UK to capture learning from our grant holders and share insights with both staff and with a range of external audiences. I think this is the 3rd or 4th event we've held on loneliness, so it's really good to have you all here to carry on the discussion. So thank you all for taking the time to join us. Now, we know loneliness can affect anyone, and it's a complex, multi-layered condition. Sometimes it's due to a change in circumstances or a life transition, and I think we've all been going through that in the pandemic. More people are feeling lonely and many people are being affected by it for the first time. The Red Cross say that 41% of UK adults report feeling lonelier since lockdown, up from 25% reporting being often or always lonely before COVID-19. And more than a quarter of adults worry that no one would notice if something happened to them. We know the pandemic has amplified inequalities in society, and some communities face a greater risk of loneliness. For example, people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities, young people, parents with young children, disabled people, and those with long-term physical and mental health conditions. And we'll be hearing from some of our groups shortly. We also know having a lower income and limited access to technology and the internet are also risk factors here. Now, the pandemic and lockdowns have meant we've all had to actively reduce our number of connections, how many people we see, meet with, mingle with even, and how we all work, where previously bringing people together and creating meaningful connections have been the focus of so many projects supporting people to overcome loneliness. We've all had to adapt to life in the pandemic, and we're still adapting to the changing situation. As we do this, recognizing the signs of loneliness, tackling the stigma around it, and making it okay to ask for help are more important than ever. We funded thousands of grants in response to the crisis across the UK, and so many of the applications talk about loneliness and isolation as part of their response to COVID-19. And existing grant holders have also adapted and flexed activity in response. This increased awareness is testament to the work that the voluntary and charity sector have been doing around loneliness for years. Throughout the crisis, we've seen just how powerful the sector can be in bringing people together and reducing feelings of isolation, and how much of this is done by small organisations and community groups. With people not mixing by necessity, our opportunities to connect are reduced, so any connection becomes important, whether that's dropping off of essentials or delivering a prescription through a socially distanced drop-off, the online group session, or connection through joint creative activity. So how have our grant holders responded? Well, we've all had to adapt to remote working, and groups have adapted their services to work within restraints, whether that's running sessions on Zoom, YouTube or Facebook, or connecting on the phone. Like the Warm and Toasty Club in Colchester, who've taken their memory afternoons for people with dementia online, running them through Facebook Live every Friday. They sing songs, have interactive entertainment, and recently debated the pie of the week. And groups have been able to offer services out of hours at times that best suit people, such as setting up support groups, like the Smith-Magenis Syndrome Foundation, who support people with a genetic disability. They set up open online sessions timed around parents' caring responsibilities, with a coffee session in the morning, tea at 3, and then space for parents to connect with each other after children's bedtimes. We've seen how grant holders have set up new activities, whether that's information helplines to signpost further support, or breeding connections through creative activities, such as Arts to Heal, who sent out a range of activity packs and encouraged people to share creations and connect. And the Mental Health Collective ran several kindness by post campaigns where they match people to send and receive handwritten messages of strength and support. We know things that give people a sense of meaning, whatever they are really important here. And we've seen enormous resourcefulness and resilience from grant holders who've not only dealt with the changing situation and regulations across the UK, but worked with the people they're supporting to adapt and evolve their services. We're hearing how people have been experiencing Zoom fatigue, so groups are doing things like running shorter sessions, setting up informal chats, and supporting people to feel more comfortable online. Others are doing things like setting up walk and talk sessions on mobiles for people without internet access. And we're beginning to see we have seen blended activities combining phone, online, and socially distanced in-person activity. In Wales, Action in Caira and Ely run a community hub. They told us how their crisis support line had over 800 calls from the end of March to June. Now, a lot of these were for food support and many for money and benefits. But they told us that loads of calls were from people who were feeling isolated and just wanting a chat. So they quickly responded with a phone a friend service where volunteers regularly check in on how people are doing and provide a listening ear. They told us it's been really popular, and the group said it's really nice for volunteers who can help from home. And you can read more on that on our Voices of the Pandemic series on our Insights page. Now, I want to mention volunteers. From our work on Aging Better, which Sophie leads, we know how powerful giving time and supporting others can be in overcoming and preventing loneliness. We've seen groups deal with the loss of volunteers and then recruiting new waves of people, doing this at pace and adapting how they work. And we're seeing a continuation of what was happening pre-COVID with a shift towards more informal volunteering and communities taking action themselves. As one participant in Camden Aging Better told us, "I don't regard myself as a volunteer, I'm just a participant. I'm part of the community and I'm a recipient as well." And I want to end by us all taking a moment to think about staff and volunteers themselves here. As the crisis has gone on, we're hearing more about staff burnout, and loneliness and isolation can be part of this. We recently ran a randomised coffee trial for grant holders in the Southwest region, where we got about 200 grant holders together, paired them up for a virtual coffee and a chat. 88% of grant holders came away feeling less isolated, understanding that others are facing similar challenges, and 93% plan on keeping in touch. And one grant holder in particular told us how she was shocked when she realised that this was the first person she'd spoken to at work who was not suicidal or a new client in crisis needing help, as she's been the only worker running the group's crisis lines and office phone through lockdown. Another told us it was useful simply to know we're all in it together, dealing with similar issues, which brings me back to you all and why we're here today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Ewan. Really, really interesting and comprehensive overview. And I'd now like to introduce Kevin, who's going to speak about his and his organisation's experience. Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you, Sophie. Am I able to see the slides? For some reason, I can't see the slides. Is that so?
Ewan has now come off the stage, so I think we should be able to see the slides now. I can see our wonderful back office team whirring away. Apologies to everybody. As you know, this is the kind of thing that happens every time, however well you organise anything, the slides will always go missing. Kevin, are you okay to just start talking about the organisation? And many apologies for this while we resolve the slides issue.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm going to just open my slides and hopefully be able to use those as a reference point.
And we will share those slides with everybody attending. And again, apologies for the technical issue here.
Okay, so sorry about that. So, so the Northeast Young Dads and Lads Project, we're obviously a Northeast-based charity. We're founded in 2017. We're independently funded by a range of grant-making foundations. We support young dads and expectant dads aged under 25 years. They range in age really from the youngest being 14, 15, up until 25, but we actually have lots of young dads. I think the slides are opening now. Great. Can we just move to the second slide, please? Thank you. That's great. So yeah, we have lots of young dads who basically continue engaging with the charity beyond 25, moving into roles as peer group leaders, trustees, filmmakers, and more recently as employees of the charity too. Young dads enter the service either through self and peer referrals, increasingly so, which is something we're really proud of, as well as through voluntary community sector organisations, social services, and health services such as Family Nurse Partnership. Our offer to young dads has been quite organic. We offer intensive one-to-one support to help them to address a range of difficulties in their lives, as well as building peer support networks with other young dads, developing new skills and confidences, particularly around parenting skills, relationship skills, and first aid. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Before COVID-19 and lockdown, probably about a year and a half ago, we undertook some research with Newcastle University to try and understand better young dads' experiences of social isolation and loneliness. It seemed to be a theme we were aware of increasingly. What that research with about 45 young dads found was that most of the young men we work with have issues around isolation and loneliness for a range of factors. We had one cohort of 6 young dads in a small ward of Gateshead who all lived on the same, pretty much the same street. They went to the same school together. They'd all left school at the same time. none of them had an idea that their peers and their previous friends were young dads, because young dads don't celebrate fatherhood. Young men have quickly learned that professionals often see young fatherhood as in terms of risk. They won't congratulate young dads about fatherhood. Young dads' experiences walking around the streets with their pram has been to be abused, shouted at. One young man described how he'd been stopped by a stranger who said, you know, if my son got pregnant, I'd slap him. So young men learn pretty quickly not to show their fatherhood status, to keep it to themselves. So in that way, they don't get to meet other young dads and build those networks. So effectively, they're alone. We work with a lot of young men who are non-resident dads due to their age or perhaps relationship breakdown. So they miss out on key events and key experiences with their children, and often they're not consulted around their children's health and well-being. We've talked about relationship breakdown, but equally young men feel isolated in terms of maternal-paternal family conflict, which often happens with younger dads, and social care proceedings. Many of the men that we work with have missed key schooling. They may have left school with low education attainment, which kind of means that their prospects around careers and training and education are quite limited. So they often don't get the experience of working with colleagues and building relationships with peers and studying with peers too. In addition to those factors, many of the men talk about being rejected by their peers from school or from after school due to their fatherhood status. They may not be able to go out and do the same things they could do before. They may not have the money, or in some cases, the young men have actively separated themselves from negative peer influences due to maybe drug and alcohol issues in the past, or low-level criminality. So these guys really are isolated and alone. Next slide, please. So our experience of COVID-19, social distancing and lockdown has been that it's made for these young men a bad problem even worse. We're seeing increasing numbers of young dads who've lost all contact with their child, not through their own behaviours, but more because it's been kind of used as a reason or as an excuse in some cases for maternal families to restrict dad's contact with their child. The impact kind of being that those young men are missing out on key periods of their child's life, and they're really missing their children. We're seeing lots of young dads who have got limited access to free and safe outdoor spaces in their own community to play. We've had examples of young men who live in high-rise blocks and just don't have anywhere to take their children to during lockdown. Lots of young dads we work with at the moment have lost work, have gone onto furlough, or have seen the closure of their colleges. For some of these young men, particularly the younger ones, it's a loss of daily routine and contact with their peers that they're missing. We've also seen the closure of local community spaces, buildings and services that these young men rely on. Or we've seen those services move online, which is great, but the problem being that it fails to acknowledge that these young men often don't have reliable access to mobile phones, to internet, to mobile phone credit, which leaves them even more isolated. Next slide, please. So our response to lockdown has been to try our best to continue to offer the same services and innovate to create new services. We've continued to provide one-to-one support directly to young dads via telephone, text, video conferencing, and walk and talk visits where we go out and meet young men, keep our distance, and we kind of walk and talk at the same time and deal with issues there and then. Our face-to-face young dads groups have moved online, so we offer regular weekly peer support groups. An example being we had an 80s themed series of game shows where we had young dads participating, an example there on the right-hand side. We've also offered young dads outdoor twilight soccer sessions that have been really, really well received. We're seeing massive numbers of young dads entertain those and engage in those activities. They really value the chance. It's the first time for many of the young men that have been out of the house since lockdown, and to kind of run around and get healthy and chat with their friends has been really important. Thanks to Community Fund, we've been able to provide lots of young dads with free mobile phones and top-ups, which have addressed that digital poverty issue. We're also creating an e-learning portal at the moment. The important thing being here is that we're trying to create resources that are made by young dads for young dads and address the knowledge gaps around parenting, relationship skills, and first aid initially. Many of the young men, when they become young fathers, look for resources, they look for ideas, they look on YouTube to try and find inspirational training. What they kind of often see is people who don't look like them, who don't sound like them, and they reject those resources. So they really want to see resources that are created by young dads for young dads, which we're now doing through animation and film work. We're also introducing live stream webinars with professionals talking to young dads. And we're most excited about the fact that our young dads are creating gaming channels. So lots of our young men we found over the years have met through the weekly young dads groups and then gone off and made connections and played on their Xboxes and their PS4s and their PCs together. And they continue to do that through the lockdown. So what we're now doing is investing in that, with young dads being invigilators for those activities. Next slide, please. Thanks for listening. If you've got any questions, please raise them now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Kevin. That's really insightful. It really shines a light on a community that people don't traditionally think about when they think lonely stereotype. So we do have a question for you from Simon Shabursky, who I believe is from Torbay. And it's, what are the best techniques for reaching and building relationships with the young dads?
Yeah, great question. We've always found that our approach has been focusing on befriending initially. What we tend to find is that, particularly because we get a lot of referrals through services like social services, that young men often come in quite guarded. They're concerned that they perceive you as being potentially kind of part of the system. So they're quite reluctant to open up. A lot of our early work is very much about doing, we play a lot of pool, we sit in cafes, we eat together. And it's about that regular contact with these young men. And we're really consistent. So if we have a young man who we can't reach, we'll find ways to reach him, whether it's through text, through telephone, whether we knock on people's doors. It's that consistency that these young men really kind of welcome and value. Over time, we tend to move young dads into connecting with other peers. And the key thing there is about finding other young dads who can be positive role models for these young men. We're really lucky now that we've worked with young men for so long that we've got 15, 16-year-old young men who've become peer leaders and inspirational young dads, and we can connect those to the younger members. And that connectivity means that those young men, it kind of opens their life really to opportunities there. They realize they're not the only young dad out there. They often stay with the service for longer because they're coming into the service with somebody else. I think the key factor there is about self-confidence. Lots of young dads don't have the confidence initially to go and knock on doors and to demand services. These guys, I'm quite surprised, but they kind of suffer in silence, really. So yeah, it's about that, just finding inventive ways. It's about, working with their interests, working with what they're about, and being flexible in your approach.
Thanks, Kevin. That's great. I mean, we're going to have to move on to the next speaker now, but I will say we've got three really good questions popping up in the questions section now. If you could type your answers there, or we can return to them in the panel, because there's some real interest in your work and it'd be great to continue this conversation. So for now, I'm going to say thank you very much to Kevin, and thank you to the audience for the great comments and questions and feedback. And now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Jane, who is going to talk to us about the work that she's doing with the organisation in Bradford. Thanks, Jane.
Thank you. Hello. So I'm going to tell you about our project called Nanny G. Now, just to let you know what Nanny G means, it's the maternal grandma is nanny, and G means respect. And some of the Nanny Gs came up with it in the first place. So if we just go to the next slide, please. Thank you. We're a thriving local community project, and we have about 600 or 700 attendances a week when under normal times. But we did notice a few years back that we were missing one vital group, and we'd had a few Asian women, older first generation Asian women, come along and join a few things. And they said to us, oh, there's loads of women out there who are really stuck at home with nothing to do, nowhere to go. And amazingly, one of my staff knocked on a door and spoke to this lady, and she'd lived in Bradford, and we're based 1 mile from the city centre. And she'd lived in Bradford for 22 years and she'd never been to the centre of Bradford. So these women were just so isolated. So when the Building Connections funding came available, we decided we would try and get some funding, and we were very fortunate to be awarded a grant. And we launched our project in January 2019, and incredibly 43 women came to the very first event that we ran, which was a big shock to us. We mostly did that by talking to the second and third generation women that we were working with, and encouraging them to bring their mother-in-law or their mother along. And so because we had such a quick response, we thought, oh, we better start something next week. So we started this weekly event called Nanny Tea. And basically it's a hub and spoke model that we've used with other groups, where this is the safe place. So like a play group would be a safe place. So it's the place that you can come where there's no pressure on you to do anything really. You can just come along, meet some other people, have a nice time, have some food. And we've used it with our refugee group as well. And it's just a safe beginning space. And so from that base, we were able to find out what people wanted to do. And we were quite surprised actually about some of the things that people wanted to do, like swimming. I would never in a million years have thought that people would want to go swimming, but they did. And as you can see, we did things like swimming, ESOL classes. We invented this thing called Explore Together, except we didn't really invent it. It was kind of stolen from a Channel 4 program where they older people got together with nursery children. We've got a nursery at Community Work. So we brought these generations together, and they've had a wonderful time doing all sorts of things. And it was really great because so many of the first generation Asian women weren't able to speak English at all. And so it was kind of great to bring the very young and this group together and learn some things together. And also what some of the nannies had said to us was that they struggled to know what to do with their grandchildren, because their grandchildren didn't speak Urdu Punjabi, and so they couldn't really communicate with them. We went out on trips and just local things that people hadn't accessed, as well as doing things like gardening and reading and writing. If we could go on to that was our 1 year anniversary event that you can see the photographs of there. And as you can see, there were lots of people. And then, of course, COVID came along, and I wanted to just share with you a little bit about the Bradford context, because unfortunately, Bradford has been really hard hit by COVID. It's a poor northern city, and obviously we went into lockdown like everyone else did, but we more or less have been in lockdown ever since, because although things eased during July, Bradford went back into restrictions on the 31st of July, and we've been restricted ever since. But unfortunately, our COVID rates have just risen and risen and risen, and so it's been a really difficult time for us. And so basically, the second year of our 2-year project has been entirely under the COVID restrictions. And one thing to tell you about our wonderful nannies is that they are just so huggy and tactile and friendly. And, you know, that's something that really you can't do anymore. And so that has been a real challenge. Next slide, please. So since March, we've not been able to meet together. As I'm sure you all know, the BME community and particularly older people are very vulnerable to COVID. So we've had to be particularly careful, and we've had to do a lot of educating people because there's been a lot of fake information. And unfortunately, in the area that we work, just around here, there hasn't really been great adherence to the guidance, and so we've had to constantly remind people about how to stay safe. And you know, as I say on the screen there, unfortunately, you know, we're 5th highest in the country, and there's only about 500,000 people in Bradford, but I think we've had about 25,000 cases. And there was a terrible article that came out just at the weekend saying how 44 Muslim deaths had happened in the last 11 days, and that the grave diggers were working from 6 in the morning till 10 at night, and they were struggling to meet the demand. So what have we done? Well, you know, we've just done what we thought we could, and you know, we're not really saying that we've done anything amazing, but what we have done is we've obviously kept in regular touch through phone calls to the ladies. And one of the things that it was really interesting actually listening to Kevin, because you know, who would compare our groups with his group? But actually there are so many similarities between them. Many of the, you know, large majority of those ladies have no sort of digital experience, and so trying to get you know, those women to learn how to use WhatsApp, let alone Zoom, has been incredibly challenging, to say the least. And we've tried our best to get some of them onto Zoom, but you know, it is something that they found incredibly difficult. Next slide, please. We were asked to be part of we volunteered to be part of a befriending service with Bradford Council, and so we took wider referrals as well as keeping in touch with all our groups. So that was something that we did in the first lockdown in particular, and we provided food parcels to the vulnerable women who live by themselves. You know, the majority of the group that we're working with live in extended intergenerational families, and you know, you might say, oh well, they're not necessarily that lonely, but actually they are, because you know, the families have sort of developed and moved on and become more westernized in many cases, and so the Asian women, first generation Asian women, have kind of been left behind really by that. And so they are very isolated, even if they're living in a family. During Ramadan, we organised some food for the breaking of the fast, the iftar, and you know, we got so many offers of help from different places. And one of the things that I think I mentioned it towards the end is how great the partnerships within Bradford have been to support each other, so that we could support everyone, because obviously certain organisations are great at the links with people, whereas other organisations are maybe great at creating art and craft packs or finding the resources for food packs. Yeah, so next slide, please.
And sorry, Jane, to break in, but I think we are going to have to wrap it up in
okay,
so we can take questions as well, but please do finish.
Yep. So we gave out craft packs, we've done ESOL on Zoom, we've done socially distant door visits, not all wrapped up in PPE as the picture shows, but just knocking on the door, taking a few steps back and having a chat, and that has been very much appreciated. We've used social media to educate people about COVID and dispel myths. Our nannies were involved in a film project, and if you get the slides later, you can click that link. Next slide, please. And more recently, just a few of the things that we've been doing is we collect surplus food, but we also get flowers and plants. So we've been giving those out to people. We got our children to make cards for the nannies during half term, and we've been buying some gifts through In-Kind Direct to distribute to people to just cheer them up during the lockdown. And we're continuing to look for new ways to try and help our cohort to not be isolated, and we're always available. And I think my last slide. Yeah, as I said, we don't claim to be experts. It's been fantastic that we've been able to work with great partners, and we're always interested to hear other people's ideas. But I guess I would say that sadly, the women are even more isolated now than they were before we started working with them, especially because they now know what they're missing out on, and we can't wait for things to calm down and get back to meeting together. Thanks very much.
That's great. Thank you, Jane. Just a quick question before we move on to our next, and we'll try and pick up some of the general questions in the panel discussion. The question is from Sam Julius. Do the ladies contact each other at this time, or is it all through you? And it relates to another question asked by Jane East, which is, how do you manage the language barrier? Do you have staff and volunteers fluent in Urdu and Punjabi?
Yes, so the language barrier, yes, we do have staff. So our staff team reflects our diverse community. So yes, we have all three of the team that work on this project speak Punjabi Urdu. So that's really great. In terms of whether they contact each other, I think some of that comes down to confidence, really, because you know, they may not have their phone numbers, or they may not feel confident to ask for them. So some do link together, but I think that what we found was when we brought people together physically in a room, that people rediscovered friendships and saw people that they hadn't seen for a long time. So yes and no, I think, is the answer to that one.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Jane. Really, really engaging presentation. And we've got lots of questions you can see in the questions section if you'd like to have a look at those. And now I would like to introduce Amy Holland. I can hear a strange sound in the background. Just another one of those technical gremlins. Jane, would you mind turning your mic off, please? Still there. Okay, never mind. I'd like to now introduce Amy, who, as I've said, is the founder of Single Parents Wellbeing PIC, and she's going to speak about that organisation and their work. Thanks, Amy.
Hi everyone. I'm Amy Holland. I'm one of the directors at Single Parents Wellbeing. So we're a peer-led community interest company, and we aim to be compassionate, positive, and an empowering approach to being a single parent, with a real focus on mental health and well-being. So with that said, loneliness and isolation has always been a really big and main issue for single parents. So even before this pandemic, research showed that single parents are more likely to experience loneliness and isolation than other groups. Because of these experiences, they are also at a higher risk of developing mental health problems, and research consistently shows that single mothers have roughly 3 times the prevalence of depressive episodes compared with other groups. So we actually went to our group, we did it a few days ago, and we asked them to fill in just a really quick poll for this event. So 95 single parents voted, and 80 of those said that they felt lonely, 56 said that they felt isolated, and 85 of them said that lockdown had impacted their mental health. So this is just a real whistle-stop tour of what was discussed in the poll, because we asked them to comment as well. So I wanted to discuss as well about the 15 that said that they weren't lonely. And lots of them said, well, actually, loneliness isn't a new feeling to being a single parent. And yeah, so we asked them to expand on that. So I'll just read some quotes. So I didn't feel any more lonely during lockdown than before. As a single parent, you just have to get on with things and the best you can. Someone else said, I feel a bit resentful of others who normally had family support and were suddenly being very vocal about it, about being on their own. I think this is because being on my own was normal for me, which was a really interesting one. And lots of people commented saying that's exactly how I feel as well. And then someone else said, lockdown is how I live my life most of the time. So I'm confined to my house when my children are in bed. I'm unable to go out. Some of my freedom is taken away being a single parent. So even just popping out for a pint of milk, you have to sort of really think about that. And that was really interesting because that's how everyone feels at the minute. And then there was one as well that said that lockdown gave them lots of opportunities to reduce their loneliness because everything moved online, and there was lots of really similar conversation around that as well. And lots of parents said that they were actually to save money and spend a bit more time with their kids because they weren't juggling sort of childcare and the run-of-the-mill sort of rat race day to day. So even just cutting down the travelling to work, even though lots of them said how difficult homeschooling was and everything like that. So lots of them were saying that they actually saved money because 68% of single parents work. So that was like a big thing for them. And then some other really interesting discussions that came out of us asking the group for this event about loneliness during the pandemic. So really interestingly, the impact of not being able to meet their work colleagues or seeing people on a school run, and the reliance of feedback from teachers and after school clubs, as well as the really obvious ones about not being able to see those that they love, even just close friends, even people with partners not being able to, with the restrictions, not being able to see their long-term partners as a single parent. And not being able to see their parents if they're like elderly or shielding. So again, I'm just going to read out some more quotes from them to sort of summarize that. So it's not just lockdown, it's the whole situation of not being able to visit friends and family and spend time with them. It's really impacting on my mental health. No adult conversation, and when my child goes to her dad, not seeing anybody, I possibly don't see anybody for days, and lots of people again reiterated that, and Dad's saying the same thing. I miss my colleagues, and that being a big part of my life, I didn't realise how much I relied on their company and conversation. And then there was a really nice one that someone summarised saying, what lockdown teaching has made me realise that they really need the teachers and after school staff, and how encouraging they were to give them a parenting boost. So for when they saw them face to face, so not having that incidental daily affirmation and reassurance took them both a while to adjust to. So the child and the parent, and then the final one is pre-lockdown. I never really felt alone in my parenting. All of a sudden, in lockdown, I did. So that was just a real whistle-stop tour of what was discussed for loneliness within the group. So single parents' wellbeing's response to lockdown and COVID. So we were able to react really quickly. And from the start, a really big element of single parents' wellbeing was our online presence. So we were able to move all of our activities online and just devour hours and hours of like Zoom, YouTube to work out how it would all work, how we could keep people safe, frantically writing risk assessments around it. But luckily, because we're peer-led, and we really utilise the wealth of experience in the group. So there's lots of teachers and lots of people helped us out with that. So we really wanted to listen and respond to the group as well. And that was like a big thing that emerged from lockdown, that we were just so grateful about the peer-led element of our organisation and how powerful it was during this pandemic. So one of the first things we did was something really simple. So we created a postcard that detailed some of the things that were just constantly being discussed in the group. And we sent this out to over 300 single parents. So it was sort of something physical for them to receive. So so it just sort of had like a mixing bowl, and in the cake it says SPW is here for you. And then it says things like money worries and CSA payments, food shopping and getting online slots, because being able to take your child food shopping is like a really big thing for single parents. So isolation and loneliness and not getting outside, and mental health, homeschooling with no help and trying to work from home, missing family and friends, co-parenting is difficult during this pandemic, and tough decision making, and who will care for my child if I get ill. So we just sort of tried to summarize it, and just something physical for them to receive at that time. So that was like a really off the cuff, well received thing from the single parents. And then yeah, so we also immediately sort of set up food parcels with the Salvation Army to make sure that anyone needed anything immediate like that. And then as things started to develop, yeah, so as things started to develop and we started like listening to the group, so there was like a lot of confusion, basically, mainly around sort of the co-parenting, and around the two households. So I don't know if anyone saw it, but one of the MPs during Good Morning Britain announced at like 8 o'clock in the morning that wherever the child was, they had to stay in that household. And you can imagine sort of the uproar that caused, and confusion on both sides of co-parenting. So we decided to respond to that, and we wrote to MPs, and we basically tried to get that clarified straight away, which we were successful in doing. And these feelings around the pandemic and the confusion, just that one element of co-parenting, let alone everything else, we really need to respond to that. So the Facebook group became like a real source of information and support for people, even for just people to have like a rant and a moan, or say really positive things. So people posting pictures of stuff that they were doing during the pandemic and just being able to share that with other people. So we wrote various blogs to highlight and give our members a voice, because they quite often discussed how they felt like a forgotten group in all of this. So because we're in Wales, the Senedd members are really accessible. So we encourage them to write to their local Senedd members. And our first blog, just about what it was like being a single parent during this pandemic, had over 3,000 views in 24 hours. So emerging from this, we set up a campaigning group of single parents during the pandemic, who are listening and responding to the group about the wider issues now other than the pandemic, so such as CSA payments, mental health, and even Black Lives Matter.
Amy, I'm afraid I'm going to have to stop you there now, because we are running into other time.
Okay.
But please do pick up all those points again in the panel. We've had some great comments on the value of the project as well. Just one very quick question to you before we move on to Robin, who is our next speaker. It's how do you get referrals for your program, and how do you kind of ensure that it isn't just people who are friends of friends, but reaching out more widely?
So that is why social media has been like brilliant for us. So we set up social media right from the start, and I think it's really overlooked by a lot of the third sectors. But basically all of our referrals, or most of them, come from our social media, and then other single parents tell their friends, and then we work really closely with our local community partners as well. But social media is a really overlooked process for people, and it's like a real necessity nowadays as well.
Great, thank you. And there's a really good question for you if you have a look at the questions section as well. So now I would like to introduce, last but not least, Robin Hewings from the Campaign to End Loneliness, who is going to talk us through latest research, and it's had a lot of relevance to all the speakers here. Thanks, Robin.
Thank you for that very nice introduction. So I'm going to talk about some work that we released in the summer, which I think has some very obvious relevance to lockdown loneliness. So we funded by the lottery, looked at the psychology of loneliness, and so I'm just going to talk a bit about some of the emotions triggered by loneliness and what that means for what we can actually do about loneliness. So as we move to the next slide, we can see that fundamentally loneliness is an emotional response. It's not just something which is about physically being unable to meet people, it's about how we feel about that. And so that means that it's really very well worth thinking through how loneliness makes us feel and how that can impact upon how we act when we think about what we might be doing about loneliness. That the much more obviously tangible physical things that relate to loneliness are clearly important. Buses, clubs for people to go to, these things are a really important part of our response to loneliness, but there is real value in thinking about the emotions and the psychology of loneliness as well. And so on the next slide, we have some of the emotions that are triggered by loneliness. This isn't just us just having a bit of a chat in the office or a chat on Zoom and coming up with some words. These are drawn from the qualitative literature on loneliness to bring out some of the key themes about how people think about and talk about loneliness. And as you can see from the ones that are on the slide in front of you, these are really powerful emotions that go really very, very deep. This is not, if you feel abandoned, or if you feel that you're not understood by others, or if you feel lost, this isn't just a kind of passing thing that is it's a bit of a pain, but it's not the end of the world. Actually, this is really fundamental to us and to our well-being. And I think one of the reasons why it helps us to understand why when people are lonely, that can have such a big impact on their physical and mental health. And so if we move to the next slide, then you can see how, given that loneliness, particularly chronic loneliness, involves some really deep emotions, there is a risk that creates a kind of a downward spiral of negative thoughts and feelings. And the problem being is that they can then make us withdraw further, making loneliness more chronic, more severe, and harder to tackle. And I think that's why we can't just say to people who are lonely, oh, well, just go and sort it out yourself. What's your problem? The point is that when people feel lonely, it takes away some of people's ability to go out and do some of the things that they need to do to reconnect. And on the next slide, we go into a bit more depth about what are those negative feelings and how do they affect how we think. Social cognition is a really great technical word, but crikey, it takes a bit to unpack it. So what it means cognition is about how we take in information and then how we process it and think about it. And so social cognition is how we think about and process our kind of social interactions. And a really kind of key danger in the context of loneliness is that we start thinking about our social interactions in a more negative way. So for example, in our kind of social life, we're always making slight mistakes. We forget to call someone back, we make a joke that doesn't quite work, or we talk about something which actually the other person finds a bit boring, or whatever. Social life is full of these little bits. And I think the real risk when we're lonely is that we start thinking about those much more, and we think about them much more negatively. And so that means that our social life becomes something which is much less pleasurable, and therefore, thinking back to our kind of downward spiral, it makes it more likely that we kind of remove ourselves from social life. Other kind of psychological factors that are associated with loneliness are attribution. So how you think about the cause of your loneliness. If you say, well, I'm lonely because that's what life is like, and that's what I'm like, and this is how it's always going to be. It's much harder, if that's how you think about your loneliness, to get out of it. Whereas if you say, well, this is a passing thing, I'm sure it will get better, and in general, I think I'm not a very lonely person. That if you have those kinds of reasons for your loneliness, it's easier for you to kind of pass through it so that it does not become chronic. Similarly, there's a set of things around if you're reasonably self-confident. Self-efficacy is about having the ability to plan and carry things out, which obviously is very relevant to kind of having kind of a social life and meeting people and following things up. And again, I suppose, and self-esteem, obviously, if you feel good about yourself, it's much easier to go out and meet other people, and to reconnect with people and to keep in touch with people. And as I was saying earlier, that loneliness has a real impact on our physical, but also our mental health. And there's a kind of two-way causal relationship between depression, anxiety, and social anxiety and loneliness. So loneliness is not a mental health problem. It's a really important part of mental well-being. But if you feel lonely, it means that it's more likely that you'll become depressed, or if you'll become socially anxious, which are diagnosable mental health problems, and vice versa. So a way out of depression, a way out of social anxiety, is to help people become less lonely. And there's really interesting research going on in the mental health community about practical ways in which you can do that for depression and anxiety, but also some severe mental illness such as schizophrenia. There are also kind of things around personality types. It's a long list, and I think I will run over time if I go through absolutely every single one of them. You can see what those are, and I think you can kind of well imagine as to why things like extroversion would be kind of helpful in relation to your kind of having a kind of full and rich social life. And so as we move on to the next slide, thinking about those aspects of loneliness, we can see some emerging evidence for psychological ways of dealing with loneliness. And to be honest, the people who are doing this the most are people in the aging better areas, who'll be able to do something which we featured very significantly in our research. Other examples would be in more kind of specialised bereavement counselling. If you read the report, we can go into some more depth about some of the particular psychological therapies or approaches that can particularly help people with loneliness. But in practice, what people do is not to follow CBT and nothing else and disregard everything else, or only do mindfulness. In practice, what we found when talking to people is that practitioners blend different psychological approaches, essentially to help people to be more aware of negative thought patterns and to develop strategies to challenge them or to replace them. So to help people be aware, for example, of how loneliness can be something that makes you think more negatively about your social relationships, and think about ways of thinking more positively and more productively about them. That's the real kind of core of what we found people were doing. But we think the insights around psychology and loneliness are not just for sitting in rooms talking to people who are volunteers or practitioners specialised in psychology. We think it's got a much wider application on our next slide, because we think that whenever we're dealing with lonely people, being conscious about the way in which loneliness can affect people can be really powerful and useful. And again, this is something which we found a great deal of this is already happening, and in our report that you can see a link to, we have numerous case studies of people who are doing this. But because of those ways in which loneliness can affect our psychology, and that our psychology can make us more lonely as well, if you think more consciously about them, then you can think about how you design services to reach them. So, for example, if you're running a group which is partially designed to help lonely people, then remembering that people might find it really hard to cross the threshold, that they might find it hard to go into a room of people who they don't know, helping them to feel welcome, to feel valued, and reminding as well that loneliness can often go up and down, and so helping people, kind of welcoming people back as well, and possibly in the right way, giving them a call, or suggesting that you've missed them and that you'd value them coming again. That goes in some obvious ways in which we think that some different forms of training may well be useful for staff and volunteers to help people just to understand this, and to help make them more conscious of the psychology of loneliness in how we do our work to tackle loneliness. So we think that this is a really useful way in which we can deepen and strengthen what we do to tackle loneliness, really kind of across the piece. If we think it adds an extra string to our bow.
Thank you very much for that, Robin. Very, very interesting presentation. I would urge everybody to read that report. It's really accessible and really builds on everything that we all know, but takes it one step further. So now I would like to open up questions to the whole panel. We've had a few very interesting chats going on about different things. We've talked about social media, we've talked about referrals and resourcing. I just wanted to start off by saying something that seemed to be a common thread and was mentioned by quite a few speakers, and that's about the stigma of loneliness. So I'd like to ask each one of the panel members, do you feel that the people that you're working with still consider feeling lonely to be stigmatized? And are people okay with saying that they feel lonely? Kevin, would you like to start with this one?
Yeah, certainly, Sophie. I think for the young dads that we work with, our experience is that many of them won't present as lonely. They won't present with a range of different things, including kind of mental health challenges as well. It's something that comes over time, and the more we spend with them, the more they open up and trust us, the more they will then acknowledge it. But it's not something they'll present with initially, but it tends to come out of conversations. But with all the young men we've worked with, the key theme in terms of support has been around befriending. It's a consistent theme for all the young men that we work with. So it's there, and we kind of see it when we have those conversations with those young men about, who do you go and see, who do you hang out with, who are your friends? And it's, well, there aren't any.
Great. Would any of the other panel members like to follow with that? Jane, what about in Bradford with the group that you're working with there?
I think that really it's varied. Certainly in terms of when we did the evaluations and asked people, I think that some of them were prepared to admit that they felt lonely. I think one of the issues that we had was that we had to translate all those questions into Punjabi Urdu, and there weren't necessarily the words to do that, so we had to alter the questions that we asked so that they made more sense. And yeah, I think for many of the cohort, it was really putting a word on something that they did feel but wouldn't necessarily have articulated themselves, I guess I would say.
Yes, and I think with Aging Better, we've seen as well the concept of loneliness itself is a very untranslatable concept into some languages. Robin, do you have anything to add to that from your research?
Yeah, no, so I think that in general, I think loneliness is still very much stigmatized. I think it can be a hard thing to admit because people say that it can feel kind of like failure. So why can't you feel connected to people? Why can't you get to go out there and see people? I think one, little silver lining of the current situation is that it gives a reason to be lonely, which is very apart from you, if you see what I mean. And so I think in a way that has opened up conversations about loneliness and how much we value our kind of social interactions. And so there is a way in which the current crisis has, I think, been somewhat destigmatizing, but the extent to which it will last beyond this period, I think, is quite hard to tell.
Amy?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting one for single parents because, and I touched on it in my talk about this, it doesn't feel any different. So, so for single parents, what they're voicing is that about those social interactions being really important, and the ones that we didn't realise about work colleagues, about people on the school run. But there's like a sense of, well, it's always like this for us, and that other people have the ability to be able to see what it's like for single parents now to a degree. And I guess like for us as well, it's just with the stigma of loneliness, it's just being able to provide that compassionate, empowering space for them to be able to express, and sometimes just being able to say, I'm really lonely. And then for lots of other single parents in similar situations to be able to say, I feel exactly the same. And yeah, it's just that space, I think, is really important for people to be able to voice that and be understood. And sometimes there's not a solution, but it's just being able to voice that is really powerful.
Yeah, there's a very good comment in the chat saying we often see loneliness as a deficit in ourselves rather than understanding how it relates to situations we find ourselves in. So blaming yourself for your loneliness does seem to be a common thread going through this as well. Ewan, have you got anything to add to that?
Well, I'd only just echo what the other speakers have said, but just say that, and I mentioned it at the beginning, that I think the fact that we've seen loneliness come up in amongst all these other emergency responses to COVID in applications for our funding, I think that is a promising sign that people are more aware of it at a project level, and this is focusing out. And then, obviously, as Robin mentioned, we're kind of all in it together, and we have another reason to be lonely, if you like, as well as the individual. But yeah, we'll see how long that lasts, kind of coming out of the situation. Yeah.
And something that another question which kind of segues into this is Richard Mole has asked, why isn't loneliness classed as a mental health issue? It's a gateway for escalating issues that, if not tackled, leads to more severe mental health issues. So Kevin, I can see you agreeing with that. Would you like to add your response?
I just think they're so closely connected, aren't they? I think in terms of we see a lot of young men who are struggling with mental well-being issues, and we know that when we connect young dads with other young dads and do work around supporting them and creating that social support network, it has a significant impact on their mental well-being.
Yeah, and Robin, would you like to add to that? Because obviously you touched on that in your report.
Yes, so I suppose what I mean is that loneliness is not a diagnosable mental health condition, but it is absolutely really important part of our overall mental and just general well-being, and that what you do to improve people's, including their mental health, may well often be to do with loneliness and to do with social connections. So people who work, for example, on suicide would say there was never a single cause of suicide, but loneliness is very often part of the mix. And I think that just kind of gives you a sense in which I think it's important to say it's not quite a mental health problem but it is absolutely a really serious part of our mental well-being. And when you do things people's social connections, you'll probably be having really useful effects across all aspects of their life and their well-being.
Yeah, and I can add with Aging Better, certainly what we've seen is people don't necessarily say that their loneliness has always decreased, but they do say that their mental well-being has improved as a result of the activities and the connections that they're making. So again, we all know that loneliness is subjective to a certain extent and not objective, and it depends on your personal circumstance. Another question that people are having is just a more broad one, and we did touch on this. How do people find out about your services? How do you get referrals in, and especially in a lockdown? And I know, Amy, you answered this through the social media, but people are saying, what about if people don't have access to social media or if they're not online? I know there's no magic answer to this, but interested on your reflections.
So for us, we developed, we knew it was really important for people to meet in real life, but actually a really important part, like hand in hand with it, is for people to be able to connect online as well. So I can't rave enough about Facebook groups around social media and around, even if it's just pictures that you're putting out to celebrate what you're doing as a different way to communicate to offenders. But also, I think so I know I was sort of reading the comments about sort of older people not being able to access social media, and then someone saying about a buddy system that's been really difficult during the pandemic. And I just think whatever way we can and how we can focus on moving more people online, because that's the way that the world is moving. And then the same with sort of what Kevin was saying as well about it, maybe just how they interact online. So like the gaming element of it, or for younger people, or for older people, it might be that they FaceTime more, or they just use technology more. So yeah, I can't rave enough about social media and how important that has been for us, definitely. But just you're looking at technology as a whole, and then any barriers for people using technology, looking to overcome those rather than just saying no to technology altogether, in our opinion, as an organisation.
Now, that was my mistake not to take myself off mute. I knew I had to do it once. So yes, would any panel member like to add to that response by Amy?
Yes, I think what we found just generally and across the board, not just with the older people, is that one of the real issues is data. So not only are some people don't have a tablet or a smartphone, but even if we were able to give them a tablet, we can't give them any data. And I know that across Bradford there's been a lot of thinking, how can we solve this, and it's really very, very difficult to solve, because SIM-only data cards aren't really very accessible for organisations to purchase on behalf of people who can't afford them. So I think that's another added problem. And I think, you know, the confidence thing with using social media for not just older people. I mean, we've got a project, we're working with unaccompanied asylum seeking young people aged 16 to 18. And fortunately, we're working in partnership with another project, we've been able to give them a tablet each. But we've had to work really hard with each of them to teach them how to use them. And if it wasn't for the fact that there'd been someone else there that could help them, it just wouldn't have got off the ground. So we do, even in lockdown, have to think of creative ways of how we can safely teach people the basics of using tablets, because, you know, it's an alien concept to a lot of people, even though many of us use them, you know, all the time.
Great, yes, thank you for that. And I could just see some great comments in the chat as well, and really focusing on empowering people and building confidence. So rather than seeing people as as things that we have to train to do, things really empowering and inspiring people to want to do it, and to be able to work themselves rather than be done to. And another really good comment, people losing confidence to interact, and that's also escalating mental health. And some really interesting projects as well, working outside. And I know as the cold weather hits us all now, that's maybe not a great an option as it was in the summer. Ewan, do you want to come in on any of the funding that we've done around addressing the digital divide? Because I know this comes up time and time again.
Yes, yeah. Well, I mean, it's obviously it's massive, and we've part of the response funding, we funded so much stuff, and data. I'm glad Jane mentioned data and Wi-Fi. That's really important. And I mean, it'd be interesting to explore some of those issues you've been facing, Jane, around that. I think it's also, you raised that you can get people the tech, but they still got to know how to use it. And we've seen some projects who've done, made videos and DVDs of how to use it rather than putting stuff online, because it's no good putting stuff online if you can't use the thing in the first place to then get online. And some other projects have given out the tech, but then made sure there's an ongoing, like an hourly open phone call, so people can phone up just to, how do I turn the thing on, or what do I do, and people can talk them through it. So that's really important to remember. Yeah, so I think that the practicalities, and we're still finding out, to be honest, the unpacking of it all, really, what these things mean, but they're really important. Yeah.
And I just wanted to add, if I may, that for us as well, it's really important to not just have everything digital or just have everything in person. There's like a really important mix of the two, which is why we came up with that postcards idea. And I know someone said about pen pals and it's just about being creative. So you can the outdoor thing at the minute where you can meet people outdoors. So it's just about making sure that you can offer the two services. It's not just one in isolation, and making sure they work together.
Yeah, no, that's a great that's a great comment. And I guess I can see in the chat some really interesting ideas about pen pals as well, and the actual process of writing. I'm old enough to actually had a pen pal, because I was a child before the internet was a thing. So but yeah, so nice to see that kind of thing is happening again. And just to highlight as well, we did run an event on the digital divide, specifically focused on loneliness. So we've got a link to that in the chat as well. And we will be sharing all of these things after this event. So just looking if anyone else has any more questions to the panel. There have been a lot of comments about the different groups of people, different communities who are experiencing loneliness. And it's just so wide ranging. We do have a lot, though, about different second language communities, and again, talking about the language barrier and how that can be overcome. I don't know if anyone else has anything further to add on that, because that does seem to be quite a hot topic. Robin, you're leaning forward.
No, I suppose what I'd say is that it's something which makes the case for the kind of funding that the lottery does, by funding local groups, such as we've heard from today, who can have that specialisation in particular communities. Because I think the nature of diversity that we have in this country is that it's a kind of a hyper diversity. It's not the case that there's 2 or 3 different groups and you can bosh them all together. The level of, just hearing Jane talk about just the difference between generations in Bradford shows the way in which we're really very, very diverse country that has a role for some national organisations, but absolutely needs really hyperlocal, really focused organisations that can make sure that they respond to the needs of their communities.
Can I just say, Sophie, as well, the needs of Black and minority ethnic young dads is something that's come into focus for us. We tend to find that the majority of the young men that we support are white British, so we're just about to embark on a peer-led research project with the University of Lincoln, looking at diverse dads and trying to understand the kind of wider needs of Black and minority ethnic young dads in our region.
Can I just say that Community Works, we're in a very diverse area of Bradford, and we regularly have people from 30 different countries around the world. So we've sort of got quite a lot of experience of working with people that we can't really communicate with. And I think really just being warm and welcoming and smiley, and I know that's difficult during lockdown, but just, you know, as we move towards hopefully being less locked down. And I think, you know, there are things, you know, we've used a lot of craft, and also food is a great one for that. And food brings people together. And, you know, just so that people can feel safe and welcome, I think are the main things. And even if they can't, you know, we can't really have much of a conversation, there are always things that you can do that make people feel like it's, you know, that we really love them to be with us. So and I guess, you know, children bring people together, don't they? And I think children and food are our top tips really for bringing people together.
I think we found that with Aging Better that a baked potato was the universal solution. Sorry to be very facile, but that was the one thing that kind of united everybody. Sadly, it can't always be done in a lockdown. But yeah, we also found that communities, again, doing it with themselves and for themselves rather than being done to, was really, really important. And that hyper-local, place-based approach, again, and peer support, again, really, really important. And I see Simon has also posted food. We call it the super connector. There is no such thing as hard to reach if you take food to the streets. I think that is a great comment. And also we have had a few comments as well about using jargon. Loneliness has now developed its own jargon, and we at the fund are very good at using that. So please always push back if we start saying something and you'd rather we said it in plain English, then ask us to translate. I hope we haven't done this on this particular webinar though. I'm going to bring the panel to a close unless anyone has anything else. Would anyone like to make any closing comments? We have a few minutes left. If anyone would like to add anything they haven't added so far. No. I think what we've seen from all of you is some great synergy, some brilliant work, some really interesting similarities, and again, some really interesting differences, which just goes to show that loneliness is not a problem that can be solved, quote unquote, with one solution. It can only be addressed by everybody working together, and especially doing the kind of work that our panel members and the majority of our audience are doing as well. So I am going to end today's webinar just by summarising a little bit about what we've said. We've talked about peer-led activity. We've talked about the importance of communication. We've talked about reaching out on social media. And we've also talked about how we address those who can't access social media, and not to just cut that option off, but to look at how we can work to make it a viable one. We've talked about stereotyping. We've talked about the relationship between loneliness and freedom. And of course, we know that the lockdown does have negative impacts for everybody, but I hope that today's conversation has shone a bit of sunlight into everybody's lives and shown that there is a way forward and that we're all working together to achieve it. Everything that you've discussed and shared with us in the chat, we are going to share. There is going to be a blog written by one of the very able members of our team who've been working away in the back office to keep everything running smoothly. And all the links as well are also posted there. If you'd like anything else, do get in touch and we can provide it, especially from our speakers and their organisations and the work that they're doing. Thank you to all of them for answering the questions, and we will continue this conversation. This is one of a series of events. We talk about all kinds of things. We'll continue to talk about loneliness, but there are other events coming up on homelessness and a wide range of issues. Please check our website for more information. And I think that's all I have to do now, except to thank Kevin, Jane, Amy, Ewan, and Robin, who has lost his internet connection, but I'm sending him my thanks anyway. Great presentations, really engaging, lovely to hear about your work, and looking forward to seeing it going forward into the future. So on that note, we're going to finish 3 minutes early. I know everyone would like the gift of more time these days, so hopefully that's a benefit. And thank you for attending. Thanks to our panel. Have a lovely day.